He could have become a king, but he chose to be something else, a symbol of democracy. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was not just the leader of a revolution. He was the father of a new nation. From humble beginnings to commanding a fledgling army, Washington's decisions and actions would set the stage for the United States to rise from the ashes of war. But what made him choose selflessness over power? Why did he walk away from the throne instead of accepting the adoration of a nation in need of a monarch? Join us as we explore the life of George Washington, the man who made the impossible possible and set the standard for future leaders of America. George Washington was born on the 22nd of February 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia. At first glance, his early life might seem ordinary. A son of the Virginia gentry, his family, though not part of the British aristocracy, owned a large plantation. His father, Lawrence Washington, was a wealthy landowner who had served in the colonial military. However, George's life took an early turn when, at the tender age of 11, his father passed away, leaving young George and his siblings to navigate the world without a paternal figure. It was this loss that set the stage for the independence and determination Washington would become known for. As a young man, Washington's education was not particularly formal, but it was practical. He was tutored by his older brother Lawrence, who introduced him to the world of military strategy, farming, and business. But it was Washington's sense of duty and desire to succeed that drove him to pursue a career in surveying, the perfect occupation for someone who was as ambitious as he was resourceful. At just 16 years old, he began working as a land surveyor in the Virginia frontier, gaining invaluable knowledge of the land and the rugged terrain of the colonies. This experience would shape his understanding of geography and military tactics, which would serve him well in later years. By 1753, as tensions between the British and the French were escalating in North America, Washington's military career began. At the age of 21, he was appointed lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia and sent to the Ohio River Valley to confront the French, who were attempting to expand their influence in the region. Washington's first military engagement, however, ended in a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Fort Necessity. Though he was forced to surrender, Washington's handling of the situation earned him respect as a leader capable of handling difficult circumstances. It was clear he possessed a natural ability to lead, despite his inexperience. His experience in the French and Indian War, which would later merge into the broader 7 Years' War, made Washington a hero in Virginia. As he rose through the ranks, Washington's understanding of military strategy deepened. He was involved in numerous campaigns, some successful, some less so. Despite setbacks, Washington's resilience in the face of adversity and his ability to rally his troops won him the admiration of his peers. His bravery on the battlefield during the war cemented his status as a capable officer. But more than anything, the war marked a significant turning point in Washington's life: his deep dissatisfaction with British rule and the realization that colonial self-governance was inevitable. After the war, Washington retired to his estate at Mount Vernon, but the idea of standing idle was never in his nature. By this time, colonial America had begun to feel the first waves of discontent toward British rule. The British Crown imposed harsh taxes and laws on the colonies, most notably the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, that were met with increasing resistance. Washington, who had always believed in the rights of the colonies, was swept up in the growing movement for independence. While many of his fellow Virginians, and indeed many of his fellow Americans, remained loyal to the British Crown, Washington began to speak out against the policies of King George III. His frustration with British interference in colonial affairs, particularly in Virginia, laid the groundwork for his support of independence. In 1774, as tensions reached a boiling point, Washington was elected to represent Virginia in the Continental Congress. His entry into the political arena was driven by a deep sense of duty to his country. He was not an idealistic revolutionary, nor a radical, was a pragmatic leader who understood the magnitude of the decisions before him. Washington believed the colonies had a right to self-governance, but he also feared that an outright rebellion against Britain could tear the colonies apart. Nevertheless, when the colonies began to raise militias and resist British authority, Washington knew he had to take action. The moment that truly transformed Washington from a political figure into a legendary leader came in 1775, when the Continental Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. His appointment wasn't simply a formality. Washington was an experienced military leader, well respected by his peers, and known for his ability to maintain composure under pressure. But the responsibility of leading an army to fight one of the most powerful military forces in the world would be his greatest challenge. At the time, the Continental Army was poorly equipped, underfunded, and made up of inexperienced soldiers. Washington knew that the war would not be won overnight. His first task was to unify the diverse colonies into a cohesive fighting force. He inherited an army filled with men who were not professional soldiers but farmers, tradesmen, and laborers, many of whom had joined the army out of duty, not passion. Washington understood that in order to win, he would need not only to command his army, but also to inspire it. Despite a series of early defeats, including the loss of New York City, Washington's leadership began to shine. His ability to inspire his men, maintain morale, and secure victories in key battles, such as the crossing of the Delaware River and the subsequent victories at Trenton and Princeton, demonstrated Washington's military prowess. These early victories revitalized the morale of the Continental Army and gave hope to the people of the colonies, showing that they could indeed challenge British might. Washington's journey from military leader to the face of the American Revolution was marked by his resilience, humility, and ability to rally people around a common cause. But as the war dragged on, would his leadership be enough to see the colonies to victory? The greatest test of his character and his vision for a new America was still ahead. Could the Continental Army endure the hardships of war? And could Washington hold the fragile unity of the Revolution together in the face of growing opposition, both from within and without? The Revolutionary War continued to wear on throughout the 1770s, and George Washington's leadership was tested at every turn. After the pivotal victories at Trenton and Princeton, Washington knew that the key to securing independence was not just winning battles, but sustaining a long-term campaign against the British. While the Continental Army had managed to outlast the British at key moments, Washington's army was still plagued by a lack of resources, poor training, and a deeply divided political climate at home. Washington understood that while the war could be won, it would require far more than military strategy. It would take political savvy, international diplomacy, and sheer perseverance. As the war continued into the winter of 1777, the Continental Army faced its darkest moment at Valley Forge. The conditions at Valley Forge were brutal. Freezing temperatures, scarce food supplies, and rampant disease left thousands of soldiers in dire conditions. Yet, amid the suffering, Washington's leadership shone brighter than ever. He refused to abandon his troops, knowing that morale was as important as military success. Under his guidance, the army began to rebuild itself, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Washington took the opportunity to reorganize and train the troops, enlisting the help of foreign officers like Baron von Steuben, who introduced the Continental Army to rigorous drills and discipline. The difficult winter at Valley Forge was not just about surviving the cold. It was about laying the groundwork for a much stronger, more effective fighting force. The transformation of the Continental Army during this time would prove to be a turning point, as the ragtag group of soldiers began to show signs of becoming a well-trained, formidable military force. Throughout the next several years, Washington's determination to lead was tested again and again. As British forces continued to mount offensives, especially in the southern colonies, the Continental Army had to rely on its resilience and ability to stretch limited resources. The difficulties in recruiting soldiers and maintaining public support for the war effort were constant hurdles. In addition to the logistical challenges, Washington faced internal divisions within the Continental Congress and the military itself, with some factions criticizing his leadership, questioning his strategy, and even calling for his replacement. Despite these challenges, Washington's leadership continued to inspire the Continental Army and the American people. When word arrived that the French government, led by King Louis XVI, had agreed to provide military assistance to the American cause in 1778, it was a major turning point. France's involvement in the war, changed the balance of power, giving the American colonies the support they desperately needed to counter British superiority. Washington's ability to unite the colonies and forge an alliance with France demonstrated his diplomatic skill and reinforced his position as the central figure in the American Revolution. The summer of 1781 marked the final stages of the Revolutionary War, and Washington's leadership was again put to the test. In the critical siege of Yorktown, Washington coordinated with French forces, led by General Rochambeau, and together, they trapped British General Cornwallis and his army. The successful siege, which lasted for weeks, was a stunning victory for the Continental Army and its French allies. On the 19th of October, 1781, General Cornwallis, unable to continue fighting, surrendered to Washington, effectively ending the war and securing American independence. Although Washington had won the war, his victory was not without consequences. The newly formed United States of America, though free from British rule, was a fragile and fragmented nation. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government, created a weak central authority that struggled to address the economic and social problems facing the country. Washington, having played such a critical role in the war, found himself drawn back into public life as the nation grappled with the challenge of forming a stable government. After the war, Washington returned to his home at Mount Vernon, hoping for peace and a return to his private life, but the struggles of the fledgling nation could not be ignored. The very survival of the country depended on its ability to establish a functional government. Washington knew that without a strong central government, the United States would remain vulnerable to external threats and internal discord. Would he return to public service once again, or would the nation's fate be left to others? In 1787, Washington was called upon once more to serve his country, this time not as a military leader, but as a guiding hand in the formation of a new government. The Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia, and Washington, ever the patriot, was unanimously elected as president of the convention. His role in the drafting of the U.S. Constitution was pivotal, as he helped mediate debates and encourage compromise among the delegates. Washington's presence at the convention was crucial. He was seen as the one figure who could unite the diverse interests of the states and provide legitimacy to the new framework for government. The Constitution, though it created a strong federal government, was still a radical idea, and its passage was far from guaranteed. Washington was crucial in ensuring the Constitution's ratification by lending his prestige to the process. His leadership during this time earned him the admiration of many, and when the Constitution was finally adopted, it was clear that Washington would be the first choice for the presidency. By 1789, with the country's new government taking shape, Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. His presidency would set the precedent for every president that followed, establishing the role of the executive branch and guiding the young nation through its formative years. Washington's leadership would not be about imposing his will, but about serving the nation's interests, upholding the principles of liberty, and ensuring that the government operated within the framework of the Constitution. Washington's presidency was about to begin, and with it came an immense responsibility to set the example for all future presidents. How would he navigate the complexities of governing a new nation, balancing the competing interests of states, the federal government, and foreign powers? Could the leader who had won a revolution now secure the future of the United States and ensure that the young country would thrive? After years of leading a revolution, George Washington now stood at the helm of a fledgling nation. The United States had won its independence, but the hard work of building a stable and prosperous country was just beginning. The task before Washington was monumental. He needed to create the new government, establish a functioning economy, secure foreign alliances, and perhaps most importantly, ensure the survival of a democracy that had never been tried on such a scale. His presidency, more than any other, would set the foundation for the United States as we know it today. Upon taking office in April 1789, Washington immediately faced a host of challenges. The most pressing issue was the creation of a stable government that could govern the nation effectively. The U.S. Constitution had set up the structure of government, But there were no precedents, no guidebook for how the branches of government should function in practice. The question of what role the president should play was one of the most significant uncertainties. Should the president be a strong leader with broad powers, or should he be a figurehead with limited influence? Washington, always careful and methodical, understood that the way he governed would set a precedent for generations to come. Washington quickly established important traditions. He created the executive cabinet, an unprecedented move composed of individuals who would serve as his closest advisors. He appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. Washington relied heavily on these men, particularly Hamilton, whose financial acumen would play a pivotal role in the nation's early survival. Washington set the precedent for how the executive branch would operate, but perhaps more importantly, he set the example of moderation and restraint in his leadership, firmly establishing the idea that the presidency should not become an office of unchecked power. One of Washington's earliest and most critical decisions was his stance on foreign relations. The United States was still a weak nation in the eyes of Europe, and Washington was determined to steer clear of entanglements that could drag the country into unnecessary conflicts. He famously issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, signaling to the world that the United States would remain neutral in the wars between France and Great Britain. This decision was controversial at the time, particularly among those who supported France, but Washington believed that staying out of European conflicts was crucial for the young nation's survival. His decision to avoid alliances set a precedent for American foreign policy, which remained largely isolationist for much of the 19th century. Another defining moment of Washington's presidency was the establishment of the nation's financial system. The United States was deeply in debt following the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton proposed a bold plan to address the financial crisis. He advocated for the federal government to assume state debts, establish a national bank, and create a system of taxation to stabilize the economy. Washington, although initially wary of such sweeping changes, recognized the necessity of Hamilton's plan. By signing the bill to create the Bank of the United States in 1791, Washington solidified his faith in Hamilton's vision, which helped establish the financial foundation of the country. Washington's decisions on domestic policy would also have lasting effects. He signed into law the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the federal judiciary, including the creation of the Supreme Court. This was another key moment in shaping the young country's government, ensuring that the courts would serve as an independent and powerful branch of government. Washington's appointment of the first justices, including Chief Justice John Jay, further ensured that the judiciary would be a strong, integral part of the nation's governance. Despite the successes of his presidency, Washington's time in office was not without controversy. The country was deeply divided over many issues, particularly with regard to political parties. The ideological rift between Hamilton, who supported a strong central government and a capitalist economy, and Jefferson, who championed agrarianism and states' rights, created the foundation for the first American political parties. Washington, always cautious, tried to avoid partisan politics. However, as the nation's political landscape began to divide into the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, Washington became more isolated from the growing ideological factions within his own administration. By the time Washington approached the end of his second term, the nation was on a more stable footing, but the challenges of leadership had taken their toll. As the first president, he had done what no one else had done before. He had laid the groundwork for a new government and guided the country through its formative years. But was it time for him to step down, or would his leadership be needed for years to come? In his final address to the nation, Washington made the unprecedented decision to step down from the presidency after just 2 terms. He had accomplished what he set out to do: establish the presidency, set the foundations for government, and unite the country in its early years. Yet, Washington's decision to leave office voluntarily was just as important as the decisions he made in office. By stepping down, Washington set a powerful precedent for the peaceful transfer of power, a cornerstone of American democracy that would shape the future of the presidency. He refused to seek power indefinitely, showing that the presidency was a role for service, not for personal ambition. Washington's decision to retire from public life was met with both admiration and sorrow. The country was deeply indebted to him for his leadership, and the thought of losing such a figure was difficult to bear. However, Washington understood the importance of limiting presidential power. He recognized that the survival of the republic depended on the idea that no leader could hold power for too long. His resignation set the tone for the democratic ideals that would shape the United States for generations. Upon his departure from office, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, but his legacy as the first president was far from finished. How would future generations remember him? And how would his presidency continue to shape the future of the nation? The example Washington set as president would echo throughout American history, influencing the country's political system, foreign policy, and ideals for centuries to come. Even after stepping down from the presidency, George Washington's influence did not fade. His voluntary resignation set a precedent that no other president had the courage to challenge for decades, but it also marked the beginning of a critical reflection on the legacy of the nation he helped create. With Washington retired at Mount Vernon, the newly formed United States faced a series of challenges that would test the very fabric of what he had established during his time in office. As Washington left the Capitol, he hoped that the peaceful transfer of power would be a cornerstone of the republic he fought to build. Yet the nation's first transfer of power was fraught with struggles. Washington's successor, John Adams, took office in 1797, and though both men were of the same political faction, Adams faced a divided nation in a way that Washington had never encountered. Washington's decision to retire was now a part of his legacy, but it left a void. The system Washington had built was still young, and the country was divided by political factions. Tensions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, led by Adams and Thomas Jefferson, created a political battleground that left the country struggling to unite under the principles Washington had instilled. Washington, though no longer in office, was still a figurehead for the nation, and many saw his absence as the beginning of the nation's struggle for unity. Would the republic survive? Or was Washington's resignation too soon, leaving the young nation vulnerable to division? He had set a precedent for the presidency, but his departure left questions about how strong the nation would remain without his guiding hand. In his final years, Washington maintained a quiet but deeply reflective position. As political tensions escalated between Adams and Jefferson, Washington's role as a leader was re-examined. Could the nation maintain the ideals Washington had instilled? Or would the growing political divisions, the rise of political parties, and the pressures of a young nation cause it to crumble under its own weight? Washington's legacy was called into question not by his actions, but by the environment that had followed his presidency. The divisive political forces, foreign affairs, and the division over issues such as the Sedition Acts and the role of the federal government made it clear that the vision of a united, neutral, and self-governed republic was far more fragile than Washington had anticipated. Adams faced foreign crises, most notably with France, and internal divisions made it difficult for the country to stand united. Was this the future Washington had hoped for? Would the experiment in democracy survive without the moral authority Washington had provided during his time in office? Through all of this, Washington remained a symbol of the pasta living reminder of the struggle and success of the American Revolution. He was often consulted by both political parties, but his counsel had less and less influence as partisan divides grew stronger. His physical health began to fail in the late 1790s, as he suffered from a variety of ailments, and his death on the 14th of December, 1799, marked the end of an era. The nation he helped to birth was now at a crossroads. Washington was gone, and with him, the simplicity and unity he had symbolized. Mini cliffhanger transition. Yet Washington's death was not the end of his influence, far from it. His legacy, while marked by the triumphs of his presidency, would continue to serve as a beacon for the generations that followed. The questions surrounding his death and the future of the United States would soon give rise to an even more profound and lasting debate. How would the country carry on without its father figure? Could future presidents fill the immense shoes Washington had left behind? George Washington's death in 1799 led to a profound outpouring of grief and reverence across the nation. The public mourning for Washington was unlike anything the young country had ever seen. He was eulogized as the father of his country, and his passing marked the end of an era in American politics. Washington's absence left the country in a state of uncertainty, but the principles he had championed, the values of democracy, unity, and republicanism remained entrenched in the American ethos. Washington's death also revealed something that had been growing since his departure from office: the fragility of the ideal of unity in America. The nation that had fought for independence under Washington's leadership was now grappling with the realities of governing a diverse and divided nation. The legacy of Washington was not just in the form of his policies or decisions, but in the ideals he embodied: the idea that a republic could survive without a monarch, that power could be shared, and that a man could lead without seeking personal gain. These were the ideals that Washington had set in motion. Yet, as time went on, the question of whether America could truly live up to Washington's vision remained unanswered. Political parties had taken hold, and the country was divided not only on the issues of foreign policy, but also on the role of the federal government. Washington had feared the rise of political parties, and in his farewell address, he warned against their divisive effects. His prophecy seemed to be coming true as the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties became increasingly polarized. Washington's decision to step down and relinquish power had set an extraordinary precedent, but it was not without its consequences. In the years following his death, the legacy of his leadership would be questioned by future generations who struggled to reconcile the idea of a republic with the challenges of governing a large and diverse nation. Would the nation he helped create survive the pressures of political division and foreign intervention? His legacy, for all its achievements, would continue to serve as a touchstone for debates over power, governance, and the role of the president. Washington's example of humility and selflessness would stand as a challenge to future leaders who would face the same pressure, some of whom would be unable to live up to his ideals. As history would unfold, Washington's legacy would serve as both a guiding light and a cautionary tale for the United States. The nation he had helped to birth was not immune to the struggles of power, division, and ambition that threatened to undo the very ideals for which he had fought. How would future presidents navigate the shadow of Washington's example? And how would America's path evolve in the face of new challenges that Washington could never have foreseen? George Washington's death in 1799 marked the end of an era in American politics, yet his influence would continue to be felt across generations. As the first president of the United States, Washington not only set the stage for the young republic's survival, but also laid down the essential principles that would guide future leaders. In the years that followed, his legacy was both celebrated and contested, but his presence loomed large in the nation he had helped create. Washington's decision to step down after 2 terms set a precedent that would be followed by every president until Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 20th century. His voluntary retirement from the presidency was groundbreaking. It was a statement that power should not be concentrated in the hands of one man and that democratic systems should be self-correcting. Washington's resignation demonstrated the power of self-restraint and service to the nation, rather than personal gain. His leadership style, marked by dignity, humility, and moderation, helped solidify the very idea of the presidency in the American consciousness. The office of the president was not one of unchecked power or monarchy, but a position of responsibility, duty, and service. Washington's example was a guiding force in shaping the nature of the presidency for generations to come. Yet even as he walked away from power, his influence did not diminish. In the decades after his death, Washington became an enduring symbol of national unity. In times of division, he was invoked as a model of leadership, someone who had put country above self and had crafted a republic that, despite its flaws, was a beacon of hope for the world. His name became synonymous with patriotism, honor, and the ideals of the American Revolution. However, Washington's legacy is not without its complexities. While he is celebrated for his leadership in the founding of the United States, the reality of his role in the institution of slavery remains a dark stain on his record. Washington was a slave owner, and his views on slavery were a contradiction to the ideals of liberty and freedom that he helped champion. His relationship with slavery was complicated, and while he made efforts toward gradual emancipation in his will, he continued to enslave people during his lifetime. This tension between Washington's ideals and his personal actions is a crucial aspect of his legacy, and one that continues to spark debate among historians, scholars, and the public. Washington's legacy also extends to his influence on American foreign policy. His policy of neutrality during his presidency, enshrined in his famous farewell address, has remained a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. Washington warned against foreign entanglements and political alliances that could drag the young nation into unnecessary wars. His advice on avoiding permanent alliances with foreign powers was instrumental in shaping American foreign policy for over a century. The idea of staying neutral in foreign conflicts, while not always adhered to in later years, continued to influence American political thought long after Washington's presidency. As time passed, Washington became more than just a political leader. He became a symbol of American ideals of freedom, independence, and unity. His image was immortalized in monuments, statues, and the names of cities and counties across the country. The Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., stands as a testament to his role as the father of the nation. And yet, even as his image was elevated to near-mythic status, the complexities of his life remained part of the national discourse. Over time, Washington's role as a leader in the American Revolution and the founding of the United States became intertwined with the broader story of the country's development. His story became one of triumph of a nation emerging from revolution and establishing a democratic system that would endure through the centuries. But Washington's legacy is not a simple one, and it is necessary to acknowledge the flaws and contradictions in his life. His failure to confront the institution of slavery fully, and his role in the perpetuation of this injustice, cannot be ignored in any honest assessment of his legacy. Yet in his time, Washington was a man who transcended his personal failings to lead the nation to victory and establish the foundations of American democracy. His commitment to the principles of republicanism and his reluctance to seek absolute power were instrumental in preventing the United States from following the path of monarchical rule that had defined much of the world. His refusal to seek a third term in office is perhaps one of his most enduring contributions, demonstrating that the presidency was meant to be a position of service, not of personal ambition. As America entered the 19th century, Washington's legacy remained deeply embedded in the fabric of the nation. But as the country grew and evolved, questions about how to interpret his leadership, his decisions, and his actions became increasingly relevant. The struggle to reconcile the idealism of the American Revolution with the reality of its practice, especially in relation to slavery, would continue to shape the national consciousness for generations to come. By the 20th century, Washington's role in the national mythos had solidified. He was no longer just a founding father, was a symbol of American greatness, a figure whose actions and decisions were the cornerstone of the American experiment. His life story became the standard by which future presidents would be measured. In times of national crisis, leaders looked to Washington for inspiration. He was a touchstone for American identity and ideals. Yet, as the United States moved through the 19th and into the 20th century, the country faced its own growing pains: wars, civil strife, and civil rights movements that tested the very foundations of Washington's vision for the United States. Washington's legacy, although revered, was not without its contradictions. While he was hailed as a visionary, his failure to address the slavery issue fully left a lasting scar on the nation. Still, George Washington's impact on the United States was undeniable. He was the man who could have ruled like a king, but chose to build something greater: an enduring republic. His leadership in the American Revolution, his role in creating the Constitution, and his presidency laid the foundation for a government that would continue to evolve over time. Washington's legacy as the first president of the United States remains as powerful as ever. Washington's leadership, while remarkable, is not without its complexities. His decisions and actions, like those of any great leader, shaped the future of the United States in profound and sometimes controversial ways. How we understand and appreciate his legacy will continue to evolve, reflecting the struggles and triumphs of the nation he helped create. George Washington's legacy, as the first President of the United States, is one of strength, humility, and unyielding commitment to the principles of freedom and democracy. His leadership shaped the very foundations of the nation, setting precedents that would guide American presidents for centuries. Yet, the complexities of his life, the contradictions between his vision for a free republic and his role as a slave owner remind us that even the greatest leaders are products of their time. Washington's story is a reminder of the ongoing journey of the United States to reconcile its ideals with its realities. As we reflect on the life of George Washington, the man who led a revolution and established the office of the presidency, we're left with powerful questions. What do we take from his example? How do we honor his contributions while acknowledging the flaws in his legacy? Washington gave us a government based on checks and balances, a nation built on the principles of liberty, but the road to that vision was not without its struggles, contradictions, and challenges. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Washington's legacy is defined by his actions as the first president? Or is his connection to slavery a defining flaw that must be reckoned with? How should we understand his legacy in the context of the modern world? Was he the ideal leader of a new nation, or a man bound by the limitations of his time? George Washington's life and leadership still have much to teach us today, whether it's about serving with humility, balancing power with restraint, or the ongoing struggle to live up to the ideals of liberty. What lessons can we carry with us into the future? And what aspects of Washington's leadership do you believe remain most relevant today? What is your take on George Washington's legacy? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. If you enjoyed this exploration of George Washington's life and leadership, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this documentary with others who may find it insightful. Join us as we continue to examine the lives and legacies of America's most influential figures. In our next episode, we'll explore the life of Thomas Jefferson, Washington's ally and successor, whose ideals of liberty were tested by his own actions as a slave owner. Was Jefferson truly the champion of freedom, or were his beliefs in conflict with his personal life? Don't miss out on the next chapter of America's founding story. Like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest episodes.